This episode of the Curbsiders is sponsored by ACP's Internal Medicine Meeting 2020. Early bird pricing is available through January 31st, 2020 at annualmeeting.acponline.org. And don't forget to use the code IM20CURB.
The Curbsiders podcast is for entertainment, education, and information purposes only, and the topics discussed should not be used solely to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any diseases or conditions. Furthermore, the views and statements expressed on this podcast are solely those of the host and should not be interpreted to reflect the official policy or position of any entity aside from possibly Cash Like More Hospital and affiliate outreach programs, if indeed there are any. In fact, there are none. Pretty much, we aren't responsible if you screw up. You should always do your own homework and let us know when we're wrong.
Happy New Year and welcome back to the Curbsiders. You are about to hear a classic episode with a fresh intro by some of our Curbsiders team members. We will be back January 20th, 2020 with brand new shows. We've got so much exciting stuff coming down the pike, things we do for no reason, Neff Madness, and lots of live appearances, whether it's at grand rounds or national conferences. 2020 is going to be a great year.
Welcome back to the Curbsiders. We are the internal medicine podcast that brings you clinical pearls and practice-changing knowledge. Today, we're rebooting an important and meaningful episode from 2018 on depression and suicide, the occupational hazards of practicing medicine.
I'm also here to help reboot this episode. I'm Beth Garbitelli. I'm a medical student at Tufts and a correspondent with the Curbsiders. I help out on Instagram. And I love to bake, and physician wellness is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, as it is for many of us on the Curbsiders.
And I'm Nora, Taranto. I'm an internal medicine resident up in Boston at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. I am a correspondent as well, have been for about 2 years now. And I also am a very slow runner, coffee lover, and also very invested in physician wellness and mental health.
On this episode, Dr. Watto, Dr. Brigham, and Dr. Trivedi had a conversation with Dr. Elisabeth Poorman about the mental health crisis that's facing medical professionals across the country. And in a lot of ways, this issue really extends beyond medicine. The depression and suicide are risks that our patients are facing, and suicide is a real challenge in many other fields and industries. And it's affecting people of all ages from all backgrounds.
We both volunteered for different reasons. I've been having some experiences with kind of overwhelming and exhausting workload that is in residency itself. I'm 6 months in now, and have had a lot of support in my residency program, but there's still kind of ongoing struggles with finding the time to take care of myself, to take care of my friends and my coworkers. And so I think that this episode came at a good time. We were reminded of it back in early-ish December when we were thinking about what would be useful at this point in the year when it's cold and dark. I also had a teaching mentor in medical school who committed suicide when I was a fourth year. And so that was the main moment where I realized the crisis that was facing us, and kind of alongside my medical student friends and residents and colleagues in the administration, kind of figuring out how to handle this as a community, I realized that it's not something we talk about enough.
Yeah, and when we were brainstorming as a group of on our Slack channel, this episode was, I think, the first one that was suggested as one we might want to reboot because of how impactful it was. So many people reached out to us on social media and appreciated that we did this episode. And internally, I think we as a team really were glad that we did this episode and sort of started a tough conversation. And, we'll hopefully do more physician wellness episodes going forward because it is such an important topic. And it's not something that's easy to encapsulate even in a 1 hour episode. And certainly the solutions are things that need to be changed on a pretty systemic level, beyond just, trying to be more resilient. And Dr. Poorman does a great job of discussing some really concrete ways that, as an individual that you can focus on. And also, she talks about some bigger ways that we can change the way that we have this culture in medicine. One pearl for me that really stood out was the notion of getting a therapist or getting in touch with a therapist before you are in a moment of crisis, and sort of when you're healthy and feeling healthy, starting that process, because it can take a while to find somebody that you connect with, and it can take a lot of time, if you're trying to make your schedule work with someone else's. And I think about this topic a lot as a little bit of an older medical student and someone who's had previous career. I went into the process of the medical education really wanting to focus on wellness and really wanting to focus on building a healthy relationship with medicine, to really be, in the end of the day, have a more fulfilling career and sort of combat the burnout before I get too deep.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Beth. I think this happens in whatever work you're doing, but there are specific things about medicine that make it a more traumatic profession. And also just harder to take care of the life things that happen to you. I think we often forget that life actually does happen in residency. I think it was Shreya on this episode who said that. And if you just assume that you can manage everything as long as life events don't happen, that's just not going to be a sustainable model. And yet the system often is structured that way so that it just assumes that you're able to take on the burden and don't have other commitments and needs. For example, a tree fell on my car this fall. And destroyed the roof and the windshield. And I had to figure out how to manage that and actually get the car to the car shop. And that's just one kind of relatively minimal, though very distressing example of how life does happen. But so much more happens.
It's so true. And I think that in some ways, as individuals, and I guess in the medical education process and the medical training, you expect to be taking time off for positive things, like you're scheduling your time off around a wedding or an engagement party or a baby shower. But there's things that come up in life that are not celebrations, that are, either inconveniences and frustrations, family issues. And you expect to take time off for your wedding, for a friend's wedding, but not for a friend's funeral. And I think that element of sometimes you're processing things in your own personal life that are emotional or traumatic on top of doing a work that can be inherently traumatic, seeing people in life or death situations. It just adds a different element of stress to your day to day. And in an unforgiving schedule, it's hard to make time even for fun things, let alone tough things.
Absolutely. I think that's perfectly well said. So with that, a little bit about Dr. Poorman. She is a primary care doctor at the University of Washington. And in addition to her clinical work, she's written for a bunch of different magazines and blogs and newspapers on topics ranging from the origins of the opioid crisis to sexism in medicine. And in addition to that, she's actually perhaps most well known for being a frequent guest speaker and blogger on depression in residency, and has shared her own story on various media in addition to sharing it so kind of poignantly on our podcast that we're rebooting today.
So we do know that this is a sensitive topic and it could bring up emotions, memories, and thoughts for our listeners. So if this is triggering for anybody who's listening, the National Suicide Hotline number is 1-800-273-8255. And we also have that in our show notes.
And if anyone wants to reach out to us directly or wants guidance on available resources, Dr. Poorman and our team have made themselves available. Dr. Poorman is available at drpoorman@gmail.com. That's DOCTORPOORMAN@gmail.com. And you can reach out to any of us Curbsiders on Twitter or email to talk and see that you get any support that you need.
we really want to be fostering a culture of caring and of sharing the burden. We really do want you to feel that you can reach out to us on social media or reach out to us by email if you feel that you need a little bit of extra support. The Curbsiders are here for you.
And we hope you enjoy this episode reboot.
This episode is brought to you by ACP's Internal Medicine Meeting 2020. It starts April 21st to 22nd with the pre-course, with the full meeting April 23rd to 25th in sunny Los Angeles, California at the LA Convention Center. We attended last year and had so much fun, got to meet so many great listeners, and we're really looking forward to this year's meeting. This year's meeting features a new educational track just for medical students called Mastering Medicine Together for Students. There will be dedicated sessions for medical students, receptions, a story slam, and a town hall where students can ask questions directly of ACP's leadership. Early bird pricing is still available through January 31st, 2020 at annualmeeting.acponline.org. And don't forget to use the code IM20CURB. Elisabeth, we've been friends on Twitter for a while now, but it's so good to have you on the podcast.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me.
We wanted to ask you, just since the audience might not be familiar with you, can you give them a one-liner and maybe include something that you do outside the world of medicine?
Sure. I'm 34 years old, originally from Chicago, trained at Cambridge Health Alliance just outside of Boston. And things I like to do outside of medicine include rollerblading and making pies. So,
rollerblading. I love rollerblading.
Yeah,
when was the last time you did that?
A week ago. I very carefully chose to do it when it was no longer cool, so that meant I could do it forever.
Oh,
very smart of you. I had some expensive rollerblades when I was a kid that I thought were really cool, but I was too afraid to try any tricks with them or anything. But they were trick skates, but I did zero tricks with them except maybe skate backwards once in a while.
Oh, it's so fun. I've been rollerblading along the Charles for 15 years now.
Oh,
goodness.
Very cool.
So in addition to rollerblading, Elisabeth, what do you do for wellness, or would you recommend to other people in terms of a book, activity?
Yeah, I think it's a great and incredibly complicated question. For physicians specifically, I think first we have to acknowledge that our jobs are by their very nature traumatic, right? So we are taking care of people who are sick, who are dying, who are facing a lot of, really challenging life circumstances. And so I think embracing that as kind of the core of our profession and thinking about, how would you support yourself knowing that you're going into this kind of environment. So I have an article I wrote called Congrats Medical Student on Graduation. Now it's time to find a therapist. So I really do believe that everybody going into medicine and actually starting in medical school should connect with a therapist, knowing that they're going to, face these kind of traumatic situations and have to process them, and they may not even have role models around them that encourage them to do that. But, even purely as a performance issue, I think that that's really important. And then, the other things that are important for anybody in terms of wellness, sleeping, exercising, eating right. I know, as we'll talk about in residency, that's incredibly challenging. So I don't say these things to, shame anybody who doesn't feel capable of doing that right now. But, I think it's occasionally important to pull back in your life and think about, what are you prioritizing? And while you're a resident, really having to prioritize your wellness over other activities. And then we may touch on this as well, but, substance abuse is incredibly common in physicians starting in residency and then, beyond. So I think, our tendency to make jokes about drinking and then drink with each other and then, use alcohol to kind of wind down. I would caution people to really think about what role alcohol is playing in their life, especially during training.
I did want to jump back to what you were just saying there about finding a therapist, because it's definitely something that I had thought about, just sort of having figured it was going to be a stressful point in my life and wanting to get through it well. I can say that I never did it. And a big part of that was because I was just I was fearful about like finding out if people thought I was seeing a therapist, that meant things weren't going well, and that I was, that I was going to get in trouble or it was going to hurt my career somehow. Is there, how do you counsel people that are looking for that? I'm sure we'll get into it, but since you brought it up, I think maybe now is the best time. I'm happy to talk about that, because that is probably the first question that I get from people when they're, reaching out to me to try to, navigate some really difficult situations. So there is very real discrimination against physicians who do seek therapy. And at first, I'll talk about the legal discrimination against physicians. So in the licensing process, I believe it's currently 28 states, and a few may have changed recently, but last I looked at this, 28 states ask if you have ever been treated for a mental health disorder in the licensing process. That being said, I think there are very few people who have actually had their license denied simply because they said yes to that question. Generally, you just have to provide more documentation. And I think that the existence of those questions actually discourage a lot of people from seeking treatment, and they're incredibly problematic. And the AMA has recently, come out against them and suggested different language that would be less stigmatizing. And the other thing is that they're probably a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in any case, that does exist. And then, of course, within our profession, there's a lot of stigma, and you don't necessarily know how people are going to react when they see that you're, seeking any kind of mental health treatment. But I would say that, for me, the fact that I decided to tell my own story meant that no one else could tell it for me.
Right.
So that was really important. And, people are going to, come at you with whatever misconceptions about a lot of different things. But I think, if you are able to confidently think through, as a physician who believes that trauma and mental health are real issues, not to be dismissed or, ridiculed or belittled, then it's very clear that, we should be, connected to mental health resources just like anybody else you would be treating. I wonder if just making it a standard part of like every training, just be like this, every trainee is going to meet with a therapist at least once a year during their training. And then like that way, if someone saw you meeting with that person, it would just be normalized behavior. And it would also, maybe you'd catch people early or something. I don't know if there's resources for that, but that just seems like a way when you normalize something, then it just will become more acceptable and people will be more likely to use the resource.
I think it's also important to make sure that your staff are trained to recognize the signs and symptoms because, undoubtedly you're going to spend hours upon hours with these trainees. And so it's helpful to at least be cognizant of what some of the first presenting signs and symptoms might look like in these trainees.
Yeah, I think the problem with that is that, we have such an ethic of putting work before everything, that by the time you notice that people are struggling, they've typically been struggling for a really long time. So, I think about a friend of mine who was so depressed that on her days off, she couldn't get out of bed to eat, but never once missed work, never came in late, and was an exceptional physician. And I think that actually that ability to always put work first is incredibly dangerous.
And that's all we know. Like we push through medical school, we push the residency with like sacrifice. It'll all be worth it in the end. However, like how do you retrain your brain to prioritize your needs and your mental health is definitely, I think you'll hear in my story, something it took me a year to do, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
To close the loop on the therapist thing, are there programs that are doing it well, or do you have an example of a way that someone was connected either in a discreet way or just like a success story of somebody seeking help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are programs that are doing it incredibly well. And your hypothetical of programs where everyone gets therapy is actually something that some programs are embracing. And for me, I think that's the most logical thing to be doing because so many of us are going to be experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts or, even just, trauma that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a diagnosable mental health condition, but secondary trauma is definitely part of our job. So there are programs that are doing that. My program at Cambridge Health Alliance, what we have are 2 psychiatrists who help connect people to therapy or psychiatry services either within or outside of the hospital system. And for residents, they don't keep notes. So there's no electronic medical record that you may accidentally stumble upon. So they're doing a lot of things to really protect the privacy of the residents. And then, in other programs, it is just kind of a normal thing. They'll give everybody a list of therapists and talk to them at the beginning about, we're really expecting you guys to go to therapy at some point. We think that it's an important part of your training. Traditionally, psychiatry has been, much better about that, although, certainly not every program is perfect. But I think in internal medicine, it's time for us to embrace that, that's an important part of being a professional is taking care of yourself and acknowledging some of the things that you're going to be going through as somebody who's caring for the sick and the dying.
Those are all incredibly important points. And before we get started, I just wanted to have a disclaimer that, this is an incredibly sensitive topic, and we're going to share some of our personal stories and end on an empowering note of how can we work towards creating a supportive environment. But in case this is triggering for anyone, the National Suicide Hotline number is 1-800-273-8255. And if anyone wants to reach out in terms of what resources are available, Dr. Elisabeth Poorman has made herself available so graciously, either via email, private messaging on Facebook or Twitter, which we will all link in the show notes, or any of us on Twitter. We are happy to talk and see that you are supported in whatever way you need. Instead of getting to a clinical case from Kashlak Memorial, we thought instead it might be better to open up the discussion with our own stories, if we're willing to share kind of our vulnerable times. However, kind of in lieu of that, I would ask the listeners to be respectful and kind of hear our stories without judgment. Everyone's experience of mental health is very different and shaped by so many factors. And I think the hope would be that we could have this conversation in a space with ears that are free of judgment and open to learning from these stories. And we've already mentioned kind of some stories already. I can go first with my own story that can, I think also highlight kind of the therapist stigma. So when I started intern year, I remember being in a room with a bunch of senior residents, and I asked them like, hey, what do you guys wish you knew differently about like starting residency, right? And I was looking for career advice, but what the conversation actually went up going into was about being aware about their mental health. And like, it turned out that basically half the room raised their hand saying that they were on an SSRI. And I was like, one, very surprised because these are high achieving, like positive senior residents of mine who at that time did not fit the phenotype of who I thought would be seeing a therapist regularly or getting on an SSRI. And then two, I honestly wrote it off because young Shreya was like, oh, I'm so self-aware. I have so much insight. I practice gratitude every day. I won't be affected by any of these mental health issues. And then little did I know, second year of residency. And this is maybe where my case gets a little bit more nuanced, but I knew I wanted to marry my now husband, and unfortunately, his last name is not the right caste, and modern India and a lot of Indians don't believe in the caste system anymore. However, to one family member of mine, his whole identity was about being a Trivedi and a Brahmin. And so I grew up in a very patriarchal family where chronic like verbal abuse and threats were the norm, and obedience around those demands were basically reinforced all my life. And I had no idea the impact that would happen if I was to stand up for something in my own life. And I felt completely paralyzed. If I got married, would this person act out on threats? What would happen to my loved ones? And on the other hand, like, how long can I wait for this person to understand? So I would make these like really weird deals with myself. I would say like, okay, once I get off nights, And once I'm on AmCare, I'll have these conversations. I'll like stand up for myself, you know? I think I recognized early on, like when I was on nights or 27-hour calls, like I was so emotionally sensitive afterwards, and like just didn't have the emotional bandwidth or energy. So I kind of delayed a lot of these talks until I just kind of became numb. And the crazy thing looking back is that, you know, it wasn't like I would have suicidal ideations, like, you know, it'd be 9/11 and I'd be at Times Square and I'd think like, well, if I just stand here long enough, maybe something will happen and end this hopelessness. And like, or even like my patients, I remember would say like, Dr. Trivedi, like you're physically slow. And it really took, and this just goes to show how distorted my reality was at that time. It took not getting a position at work to really break the camel's back. I think it was like a sign for me that like I was not valued at home. I wasn't valued at work. And then like life was just spiraling out of control. And I will never forget those 2 months. I was just like in a complete fog, and I'd like would be crying out loud at night to sleep. And it was completely not who I did not recognize myself anymore. And so that, it's funny I say like, I won't forget those 2 months, but those 2 months were literally a fog of life. But a couple of things that like helped me get out of that state and to have the courage to elope against my family is one, finally seeing a therapist. And I think I have so much gratitude for all the people, my colleagues who always said like, sorry guys, I can't come to this meeting. I have to see my therapist tonight. Kind of like normalized it for me. Even though it took me, I should have probably gone a year before. It was so helpful to find that courage and go through a lot of frustration and pain and be able to stand up for myself. And I think like a second thing was kind of starting the Core I Am podcast. Having a creative outlet was honestly saved my life. Just something where you know, my life at that time felt out of control, but just to have something, some outlet that was consistent, that was safe, that I knew if I put hard work into, something would come out of it, really, really helped me. So I think this story taught me two things. One is that, you know, talk and tell people you see a therapist. You never know who it might be helping. And then two, like having an outlet can be, I think it's actually been studied, having a creative outlet in medicine can help prevent some of these issues. And I know a lot of people blame like mental health physicians on the medical system, which is a huge part of it. But I think my story showed me that like, yes, people have life outside of medicine and might not have the most privileged backgrounds. And unfortunately, like medicine doesn't have a lot of wiggle room for when life things happen.
Shreya, I want to thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's a deeply personal experience for you. But I think, you know, your story is very specific, but it touches on a lot of things that I hear from people, which is, first of all, that idea that that's not going to be me, right? So even while people are role modeling around you, and thank God that they did that it's okay to get therapy, that it's actually, you know, a part of being a good professional is to take good care of yourself, that it still took a long time to, you know, kind of break through that. And, you know, certainly, you know, I had a friend that I really admired that had started residency a year before me and really spiraled out and was, you know, incredibly sick and was, you know, so vulnerable with me and sharing, you know, what she went through. But, you know, before I experienced it myself, I think as a self-defense mechanism, I kept trying to think about all the ways that we weren't similar, and that wasn't going to be me. And I think, you know, I'm really grateful that I had her to talk to. Even if I wasn't as receptive when she was going through what she went through. So, you know, having gone through what you've experienced, you know, will make you so much more available to people as an educator and as a colleague, you know, when they inevitably experience things. And I think the other thing you said, which is that as long as nothing else in your life is going wrong, you can work those 80 to 100-hour weeks. You can, do 2 hours of paperwork for every hour you see a patient. You can, churn out discharges like that. But unfortunately, we're human beings who have life circumstances, and sometimes we need a little bit more help, and we need to step back. And unfortunately, I think that the pace of work, particularly in residency, but this is a problem that continues forever, that it makes it very difficult for us to give ourselves the space that we need to heal when difficult, traumatic things are happening, or even normal things like maternity leave or having the flu. That it's really hard to prioritize taking care of ourselves. And then I also want to especially thank you for talking about your family situation, because I think if a lot of your by nature of how medicine is, a lot of our role models and supervisors are white men, and they can't necessarily relate to what we're going through. So as women or as underrepresented minorities. So I think the fact that, you have this life experience and you're willing to talk about it is going to be so helpful for people who feel alone in the specificity of their suffering.
Absolutely. Stuart, did you have a story you wanted to talk about?
I was going to talk about one thing, and then hearing what you were saying kind of made me want to change it just a little bit. Before I was born, my grandfather, so his wife passed away when she was like 40 years old. And about the year after I was born, he tried to hang himself. And this kind of like painted the way that I looked at suicide throughout a good portion of my life, thinking that, I was stronger than that there was something innately just wrong with my grandfather. He was a coal miner. He came from a very poor family. He tells me these wild stories about working with just wild stories. And I would just kind of like shrug it off. And then I'd look at some of my family members, and they were just weird. I've got a cousin with schizophrenia. I've got other cousins that have schizoaffective disorder. It's very, very strong in my family. And so, I would just think there's something just innately wrong with them. And I'm stronger than that. That's not anything that I've personally dealt with myself. But when I met my wife, I didn't know this at first, but her mother committed suicide when she was 15. And a lot of that trauma, a lot of that history just kind of built up over the years and affected my own sense of self-worth, self-identity. And I started seeing a chaplain actually when I was a first-year medical student. This is just the first year of medical school. And looking back on it, I'm thinking, my gosh, how in the world did we get through that? We had 2 kids at the time, and we both started seeing counselors at that time. And there's a lot that got us through that. Mine is certainly love for my wife, for my kids, but also understanding and embracing the fact that I'm not perfect. And it's the quintessential story of walking down the road and the perfectionist who's looking at every single bump in the road that misses the fact when he hits an intersection, he gets hit by a car. But someone who's willing to look at the cracks in the road and say, you know what, I'm going to trip every once in a while, but I'm going to keep my head upright, look forward, eyes squared straight, and I'm going to see the intersection. I'm going to see it before it comes and hits me. And that helped because in residency, we had another child, but unfortunately we didn't know until about 2 years later that this child had severe autism. I got back from a deployment. So I was deployed overseas. And so, yeah, if anyone listening to the podcast doesn't know, in the Air Force, I was deployed overseas, and my wife was concerned. We got back, and it's like the house of cards just broke down around us. Both of us just destroyed. And as I'm trying to pick up the pieces of that, she and I went to counseling together. We'd been in counseling for about 6 months or so, and I couldn't bear the thought of this happening to someone else. It would haunt me. And so I would walk up and down the hallways at work trying to say, look, does anyone else need help? Because one thing that keeps me going is helping others as well. I mean, that's what gives me a sense of purpose, helping my wife, helping my kids. That's what helps to build me up. And there was one day, it was around 7 p.m., I'm walking by, and this colleague of mine who I adore, who I never would have thought this. He's the last person there. And I'm walking by, and normally I'm hearing like keyboards typing. This This colleague of mine is not someone to stay late. It's just quiet. He's the last person there. So to make a long story short, I walked in and he was not planning on making it home that night. He was planning on doing something, and just some of the subtle symptoms I'd recognized in him, things that I'd recognized myself just 6 months earlier. Sat down, talked to this gentleman, and it was surreal. Just the whole thing was surreal. And just that one episode and everything else kind of up to that point really changed my own career trajectory. I wanted to be an academic GME physician, then coming to realize that we're the problem. At least that's what it seemed like from my standpoint, that we inundate ourselves with all of these inane responsibilities because we want to say yes to everything. But when we start to shoulder that burden by ourselves, we realize that we can't do that. And we've got to be willing to kind of bear it all with one another, be a little more transparent, understanding that there's a breaking point for each and every one of us. I wholly ascribe to the idea that counseling is vitally important for trainees, but also trainees with family, as myself, because there is a burden that your family does not understand. And it's difficult to translate that in a way that makes sense to them. And until you're able to do that, you're not going to be able to bridge that gap. That's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Stuart, for sharing that. It's a really difficult thing to go through. And I think, what you experienced with your colleague, clearly brought up a lot of, issues with, your family history and trying to, put that all into perspective. And I think it rings so true for me. Mostly what I hear about in terms of suicides are suicides that people have experienced of colleagues, and suicides that were never called a suicide officially by the program. And I think that is so hurtful to people. And it's hard to know how hurtful that's going to be. But, I get approached by people who have been in practice for 20, 30 years. And the thing that they want to talk to me about is the person that they lost in medical school or residency that they know killed themselves, but they were never allowed to call it suicide because that same stigma that exists in our country, we bring into medicine and perhaps even amplify it within medicine because we want to be perfect. Like you said, we don't want to say no. And saying no is so important. I think the fact that we haven't wanted to say no is part of the reason that the environments that we work in have deteriorated so much because we haven't pushed back and said, perhaps seeing 20 people in 4 hours is not actually safe. Perhaps this amount of documentation and such is not safe. Where are the safe patient limits for physicians? And I think part of the reason that we haven't been able to organize for one another is that we don't want to admit any kind of weakness in ourselves. And so it can make it incredibly lonely when you're struggling. And then I think, you're absolutely right. It's very difficult on family members. It was, of course, very difficult on my family when I was struggling. And I think, there's certain programs have acknowledged, especially for partners, your partner is the person that you go home to, that you want to talk about, your day with. But they get traumatized by the stories that they hear from us as well. And they also need support, and they're, they're also going to need, somebody to process things with as well. So I think that's such an important point. And I wrote another piece called What I Wish My Family Had Known About Residency. And I wrote it because I received this really beautiful letter from a man whose brother who had committed suicide. And he really had wanted the program to openly talk about it, and the program had declined to do so. But, what he kept saying to me was, if I had known what I know now about how common this is, I would have been a lot more worried when he told me that he was struggling, and maybe I could have never stopped it, but I feel like I would have gone down there a lot sooner and checked on him. So I think that's really important for family members to know that, that this is something that's going to touch a lot of us, and that it's also going to affect them.
It really makes me think when we have our white coat ceremony in medical school, or I guess they don't do anything in residency where all the family members come, but why don't all the deans address this openly and shoulder some of the burden, it's not burden on family, but really help them understand and prepare. Cause it's something I still struggle with the language of how do I make my family and my relatives understand, I'm at a residency now, but the stress and there's so much that is still there. They're like, okay, you're settled now. I'm like, no, I'm not settled. The academia world is not any more forgiving. So anyway, sorry. Elisabeth, did you want to share a story of yours?
Yeah, sure. I think, for me, a lot of what I experienced was much more specific to residency. But I think what I've learned in retrospect and what I continue to work on is thinking about empathy as a discipline. So I don't know if any of you guys have experienced this or if any of your listeners have experienced this, but I'm the kind of person that if I walk into a room and someone is really sad or really angry or, whatever strong emotion that they're feeling, I will walk out of the room, carrying that feeling in myself as if it's my own. And that is an incredible tool for me clinically, but it also makes it, very difficult to work in a high stress emotional situation. And I think the lesson that the mantra that was repeated to me in medical school was, be more empathetic, be more emotionally present with your patients. But I think that is a useful thing for people who don't have a lot of natural empathy. And for those of us who do have a lot of natural empathy, actually what we need to do is to learn to manage that, to, recognize, what the other person is experiencing, but also, maintain our own boundaries and our own emotional health. So that was something that, really, I think played a lot into what I experienced my intern year. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and a lot of my patients are immigrants. And, what we were able to offer immigrants in America, even though I was at a program that, really valued taking care of immigrants and, did as excellent a job as they could, they still face a lot of serious injustices. It's almost impossible to get dialysis. It's almost impossible to get a kidney transplant. And, on top of that, the, rhetoric around immigrants in the past couple of years has been very, very difficult for my patients. So I think, thinking about those kinds of injustices, and some of the really, truly terrible things that they were facing, and I couldn't do anything, for them, both for my American-born patients and for my foreign-born patients. I really took those things home, and I was terrified of making a mistake. And so I kept, staying later, double checking, triple checking, and then, really neglecting my home life. And I had almost no support system outside of the hospital, and I wasn't sleeping. So things rapidly, became clear to me that I was depressed. But I think what was so fascinating to me, both at the time and in retrospect, was one, how ashamed I was that I was depressed, because I felt, like I was doing my dream job and I had no reason to be depressed. And what did this mean if I wasn't happy doing my dream job? And then the other thing was that so many people responded to me and told me that this was just normal, and that everyone who went through medicine felt like this, and it was just, part of the training process. And I think, what's really interesting about experiencing a mental health disorder, if anybody has, who's listening to this, is that, you kind of lose your sense of reality. And so when you are losing your sense of reality, but then you also have to reject some of the messages around you that this is normal, that you're going to get through it, that you don't need treatment, that was very unsettling to me. And when I got better, or when I was starting to get better, we had those first couple of suicides in New York of residents jumping off of buildings. And I was looking around at people that I practiced with, and I realized, so many of them had told me in confidence about, what they had experienced, but they weren't willing to discuss it. And it seemed to me that this was the true sickness. And even in my deepest, darkest depression, I started taking notes, and I felt like this was a story that I had to tell because I didn't want other people to experience this and feel like they were the only one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Elisabeth. And I think amplifies why we need to continue advocating for this and why this episode is also so important.
I had some comments just based on, I don't have like a really specific dramatic story. And I think in general, I've more been prone to, like, I guess sort of just like in general, these just bouts of, I don't think I would call it depression because I don't think it would last that long, but it was just more always, I think a lot of people in medicine are probably perfectionists, particularly internal medicine, which is why we love like 100 problem lists that we get to like make look beautiful.
Hashtag problem lists.
Right. So,
I hate hashtags.
Yeah. So I just think that most of my depressive symptoms or self-hate things like that, I was able to use to become like a very good runner and to work out a lot and, in some ways to succeed in my career, but certainly not the best for me. And so I really think that is something that probably a lot of people, probably in medicine, also would struggle with. And these periods, talking about suicide, I don't think that I would have, personally, I don't think I would ever commit suicide, but we were talking before about this passive suicidal ideation, which I think it's a term that I like recently learned about. I was like, oh yeah, I think I've probably gone through periods of that because it's basically where you're acting in such a reckless way that you wouldn't actively commit suicide, but you're not exactly like, you wouldn't be upset if something happened.
Right.
And, I've gone through periods where my wife can just tell that I'm very sad and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, this is just me, just, being hard on myself. And probably 3 years ago, I basically just like, this is also around the time we started the podcast, which kind of links up to what Shreya is saying, where I just like, I needed to do something, that I felt was meaningful. And I was really doing a lot of like reading and how can I overcome these like periods where I just go through and this, just constantly beating myself up because I used to like, I used to think being a perfectionist was like an awesome thing, but I no longer think it is. And I think it's like almost like if I was at an AA meeting, I'd be like, I'm a recovering perfectionist. Which those of you who work on the show, if you see that from time to time, I apologize to you, but
that's okay.
It is, yeah. So I think a lot of people go through that, and for me, the negative self-talk thing has always been the biggest. So a lot of things that I've read and a lot of like practices and things, I've learned to recognize it and try to overcome it. And I'm sure that if you have a perfectionist who's fighting an uphill battle in a medical system, which we've talked about, where they want you to see more patients and do more paperwork than you possibly can, I think that's certainly contributing to this problem that we're talking about.
Yeah, we were talking about before we started recording that one of the things that my job allows me to do is actually speak with physicians talking about burnout and just kind of privately ask them about their own history, what their thoughts are, and everything's confidential. But interestingly enough, the majority of physicians that I speak to say that at least sometime during the training or during their early staff careers, specifically early staff careers, they do have these passive suicidal thoughts. It's not something that's unique amongst one or two physicians. It's pretty much a shared issue. And the burnout surveys that we give these physicians, nurses, technicians, LVNs, etc., the highest burnout is typically seen in these younger physicians. Mm-hmm. It's a shared thing.
You mean early career physicians?
Yeah,
right?
early career physicians. Yep.
Yeah. I just think it's, and to describe the feeling again, it's just one of those things where it's like, gosh, I would never kill myself, or I don't want to kill myself, but if something happened, it would just be so much easier.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can say that, I have not had a period like that for quite a long time. Now that, once I started sort of like doing things to try to get and be open with my wife about talking about, when I was struggling, and she'll point it out to me when she notices changes. So,
Matt, I thank you for telling us that. I think, you bring up a really important point, which is that, suicidal thoughts and depression often coexist, but they don't have to. And I think, particularly when we think about sleep deprivation, you can have, with sleep deprivation is an independent risk factor for suicidal thoughts, particularly. So I think when we're thinking about work hours and how residencies are structured, and, whether or not we shame residents for taking naps in the hospital, that, we need to think about the risk to their lives when we do that. But I think, also, a lot of times when people do commit suicide, what is the thing that we hear from their colleagues? It's, that we would have never suspected, right? That they were the last person that we thought that would do this. So I think, just because someone appears to be outwardly doing well, oftentimes those are the people that you need to be the most concerned about.
So Elisabeth, we're talking about depression, mental health, suicide. Can you tell us just a little bit about like what the life cycle of that's like in the career of someone in the medical field?
Yeah. So I think I would summarize, what I've learned about this topic by saying that depression and suicide are occupational hazards of training and practicing medicine. So, when we pick people to be medical students, we're naturally selecting for healthier people with better support systems, people who are smart, generally people who have not experienced a major illness, including mental illness. And then during medical school, we see our first big jump in mental health disorders. And I just want to, point out that a lot of people think about, how do we select for healthier people so we can prevent this? We are already doing that. So that's not the problem is in student selection. The problem is in the actual training. And that probably peaks in the clinical years, around third year, when there is, some abuse. And then, people are also experiencing death and dying in a very real way for the first time. And then things get better. And then in intern year, we actually have the biggest spike that we know of for people going through this process. So that, when we start intern year, only 4% of us are going to qualify as having clinical depression. But at some point in intern year, 41.8% of interns are going to have clinical depression. And I think, those numbers, if they surprise you, I'm glad, because I think, if we really wrapped our head around how big this problem was, how common it was, then we could start acting differently about it. And then what happens in the rest of residency is a little bit less clear. We don't have as good a study, but in the early career, which we were talking about before the break, people lose their support system, and something that was very surprising to me is, you kind of also lose your sense of purpose. You have this like external purpose. You're in a, high stress environment, but an often very rewarding environment where you're saving lives, you're teaching, you're connecting with colleagues, and then suddenly you're alone. And this is more drawing on stories that I have heard, from around the country, but there does seem to be a big spike in suicide in that first year that people are out in practice on their own or in fellowships. And then, depression and suicidal thoughts continue to plague us throughout our careers.
That's something I wish I had known finishing residency. I'm pretty like aggressive with mentorship and whatnot, but I wish I was like, oh, I'm just going to fellowship, man. And then like the purpose and the existential, I can't even describe what happens, but
Shreya, there's a book by Sebastian Junger. I think that's the author. It's called Tribe. And I heard him interviewed, and I've read the book, and I heard him interviewed talking about it. But he talks about these young soldiers who are on the front lines in like really intense conditions, where they were almost horrible living conditions, where they're in firefights every day, and they come home and they had such a sense of like being tied to a community and to going through this shared awful experience. And such a strong bond that when they went home, they just could not experience that same bond. And Elisabeth, I think that's kind of what you're describing on a little bit of a less intense level when you leave a training program where most people might feel they have that.
Right. Yeah. Jamie Riches is a physician in New York who wrote a really beautiful article about losing a colleague to suicide, and she was saying that, working with people who had actually, been in the Army as you guys have, or been in military as you guys have, and then, thinking about how PTSD and trauma are similar or not similar, what they said is that, when you're in war ends or you go home, but, death, dying, disease, the difficulties of working in the hospital, that's constant. It never lets up. So, so I think there are some interesting lessons to draw there, but there's definitely, distinctions. And, it's been a very humbling experience for me to try to continue to do this work as a primary care physician, because, I feel like I've kind of wrapped my head around the training environment and ways that programs can be more supportive. But, in primary care, it's a very difficult problem. And I remember, thinking about this, I was having a conversation with Elisabeth Metro, who's a researcher and speaker who works at Primary Care Progress. And she kept talking about loneliness for physicians that she was connecting with. And I think, I would say that, in residency, the problem is exhaustion. And in practice, once you're out of residency, the problem is loneliness and isolation.
I think maybe we should jump to some of our mini cases to help us kind of practice and navigate these hard situations. I think a troubling point is that, or a pain point is that I think we've all heard supervisors or people in leadership positions that have said like, yeah, we used to work like these 100 hours, like wake up after like a 4-hour nap, not complain or be depressed. These medical students and residents are just weaker. Like, they have duty hour. We didn't have these things. What do you say to that type of thinking?
I think it comes from a place of wanting to be self-protective and not willing to really confront how big this problem is. So I understand, but I will say first that, probably a lot of them were in programs where their own humanity was also denied. So, when they were struggling, when they, really needed help, the response was, just suck it up. And I think, I hear from people, they kind of phrase it as, when I was struggling, nobody cared. So you guys just, need to pull it together. And I think what they're actually saying is, no one had, kindness or empathy for me. Right. And now I don't have it for you. Which I think, especially, I work now with a lot of people who experience trauma, and I can kind of recognize that as sort of the generations of trauma that we've experienced in medicine. So I think that's the first thing. And often when I talk to, people who do say that in person, they will eventually come to the conclusion that they were also depressed in residency. So that's also an interesting experience for me. But the second thing I would say is that, I think most people have acknowledged that actually the clinical environment has gotten a lot worse. And it's particularly gotten a lot worse for residents, because the amount of work, and especially the administrative amount of work that we're expected to do has just exploded. So, residents, I think it was an Annals paper a few years ago that found that residents spend just 7 minutes of FaceTime with each patient, that we're doing, 2 hours of documentation for every hour of clinical care. I think that's from AMA. But we're also doing more admissions. People are spending fewer days in the hospital. And then the pace of medical knowledge is just, rapidly increasing. So in 1980, doubling time of medical knowledge was 7 years, and now it's closer to 73 days. So if you're trying to keep up with all of this, and then I think we're just sort of reaching these kinds of natural limits of what the human mind can do and handle. And I think, duty hours were a really important and thing for governing bodies to do, but they're not enough, and they don't deal with this problem of work compression, and they don't deal with what are safe limits for what physicians can do to to take care of patients. So I think we need to be physician centered and patient centered when we're thinking about what's a reasonable thing to ask of residents.
Have you seen or heard of changes that are going to be enacted to hopefully make some of this better? I mean, I agree with you. I think the work compression is just such a problem. I was talking to a resident that at Cashlack one time, and she was telling me that she really felt guilty that she wasn't spending enough time at the bedside with her patients. And I told her, I was like, you need to take that guilt off of yourself. Like, I can't imagine someone working more efficiently than you do or harder. And the system is not set up for you to spend a lot of time at the bedside. And that's something that people are hopefully working to change. I know I plan to use the microphone to help influence that as much as we can. But this, the residents are feeling that way. And I think not just residents, I think probably all physicians are feeling that way to some extent.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think at least we're stepping away from that perfectionism that, keeps us from being honest about our own vulnerabilities. And I think that's the first step, because, naturally any system, right? You want a system where the average person can provide excellent clinical care. And instead, what we have is a system where, only the superhuman can make it through and provide the kind of care that, we would want for ourselves and for our loved ones. And that's really problematic. So I think that, there are some positive changes definitely happening on the residency level, in terms of, thinking about, creating a healthier clinical and learning environment. In terms of, people actually in practice, there's definitely movement. But I think, we struggle with defining the problem. And we struggle with, taking responsibility for the fact that, there is just a certain amount of work that's not reasonable to ask people to do. And I wish that, when we're talking about burnout, we're talking about, those external factors, if we could, start there and say, what can we expect from people?
That kind of begs the question too. So if let's say that you're that intern and you're signing out to another intern, and you notice this other intern's making mistakes, just seems slow. You're worried that there's something going on. What can you do? How do you navigate that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I would first say that by the time people are making mistakes and they're visibly struggling, that they've probably been struggling for a while. They're probably a lot sicker than you realize, because as I mentioned before, physicians will prioritize work over everything else. So, if they're at the point where it's visibly affecting their work, then they've probably been sick for a very long time. So that's the first thing to think about. And I would say I don't really have, particular phrases that I say to people, but when I am worried about them, I try to think about those conversations that I felt were healing for me. And, those were largely conversations that didn't take place at the hospital. People made time to, speak with me outside of the hospital, and, really just check in and say, how are you doing? It seemed like maybe you were struggling, and I want to share with you that, I've certainly experienced that. If it would be helpful to you, I'd like to tell you about, what I've experienced as well. And then I think, as Shrey was pointing out earlier, if people just make it a habit of openly talking about their vulnerabilities, about talking about going to therapy, then it's so much easier when somebody really needs it. You've really practiced what you preach to talk to them about getting connected to care.
Yeah. I think the one other thing about this case, because we do a similar kind of case OSCE, what I find is that a lot of trainees that are going through the case, and including myself, because I had to go through this case as well. I think I'm upsetting some people about telling them what the OSCE is about. But I think the hard part is with these colleagues, it's so easy to normalize what they're feeling, which is important. However, taking that extra step to also just say like, hey, are you having any thoughts of hurting yourself? Is so important, because can you imagine if that was the last conversation you had with this person and then something happened to them? I think I think there needs to be a step where you take yourself out of the kind of friend colleague role and maybe put on the doctor hat a little bit, is maybe what I would also add.
Yeah, I think that's so hard because we have so many blind spots about ourselves and about our colleagues. But I think that, suicide is so common in our profession, and certainly suicidal thoughts are so common in our profession, that it behooves us as colleagues and especially as administrators to think proactively, if somebody is in that situation, how are we going to handle it? Because I've heard so many stories from people who have said, they were suicidal, they disclosed it, and they were told that they had to go to the emergency room at the hospital that they work at. And sometimes, you're in a very, rural place training, and it can be very difficult to think through. But I think, just taking that, extra time to really, sit and think through, like, how are we going to manage those kinds of emergencies that we're necessarily going to encounter if we're involved in training or if we're involved in medical practice. Like that can make such a difference. And then responding compassionately and thoughtfully to somebody who's really struggling.
Can you highlight a couple? I know we're running out of time here, and I wanted you to highlight just a couple of the programs that are doing things well to address mental health and suicide in trainees, and then maybe we can end with some questions from social media.
Absolutely. So the program that's been written about the most, and I think it serves as a really fantastic model, is the Stanford General Surgery program. This was a program that was touched by a suicide of one of the residents, and very, very difficult for them. And the program responded by creating these debriefing sessions for their residents. And these sessions, importantly, are run by mental health professionals who don't have other roles in the residency. So they're not evaluating residents, because I think sometimes these debriefing sessions are run by chief residents, or they're, run by other administrators or attendings. And then people can feel sort of pressured to not share, to only share specific kind of experiences. So they create those kind of safe environments, and then those mental health professionals can serve as liaisons for connecting people who need, more help outside of those kinds of debriefing sessions. But I think that program has really acknowledged that, and then they also do things like stock healthy food in the refrigerators. And importantly, they let the residents evaluate the program and make sure that it was appropriate, that it wasn't somebody in practice deciding what was going to be helpful for residents. It was the residents themselves deciding what's going to be helpful for them. And then Boston Medical Center, I know, has done a lot of work about reducing paperwork for residents. So along the lines of thinking about, saying no and, what are safe limits and just, pushing back a little bit on some of these mounting administrative tasks, they've really embraced the idea that, residents should be spending their time at the bedside, should be spending their time learning. So taking seriously, getting outside hospital records, is that really a resident job?
Nice.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. Standing ovation.
Yeah, I think that that's been fantastic. And at Cambridge Health Alliance, I think like we talked about before, we have those psychiatrists who have really opened themselves up to helping residents get connected to care and really being incredibly proactive about saying we're going to do everything we can to protect your privacy, because it's incredibly difficult to protect the privacy of residents. They work in almost every department of the hospital. They know everybody. So if you are not twisting yourself into knots, thinking about how do we protect residents' privacy when they're seeking mental health care, you're not protecting their privacy. And I think that's something that administrators really, need to know and understand. And then also to ask, chief residents and program directors to not make themselves into unintentional barriers for people seeking care. So, I've heard about in many programs, program directors telling people that they need to get permission to go to therapy, or that if they're going to therapy, they need to talk to their chief residents. And I don't think that that's appropriate. And I think that, while some people will still access care, a lot of people who really need it won't.
Yeah, we have to make the bar lower, because if you take a depressed person who's probably not feeling super motivated, it's going to be hard for them to, if it's really complicated for them to get care. It's a huge bar, especially if there's social stigma and implications. So I mean, that's a huge, if listeners have suggestions about that, please send it out on Twitter or comments in the show notes or whatever.
I've sat on my therapist's couch and I'm just like, can we telehealth? I had no energy today to come in, but I had to drag my, she's like, that's an interesting idea. And I was like, yeah, let's telehealth.
That's not a bad idea, because then no one needs to see you go.
You can also bill for that.
Yeah, I think that that's a great idea. And I think, especially in rural programs or programs where, the whatever hospital system you're working in has a monopoly, so it's very difficult to go outside of the system, that there's a lot of enthusiasm about telehealth. So I think, every program can make this work in a thoughtful way for their residents. And I think, if we're not willing to provide that, it's sort of like, telling firemen, well, we can't afford the protective equipment that we need. You can't have a firehouse if you're not going to be willing to do that for people.
That would be a great project for one of the listeners to take on. Create a national telehealth network for physicians and trainees who need mental health help. That would be
build it into an app.
That's going to be the next Gold Humanism grant.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Let's
right.
do it.
Yeah. So let's transition to some questions from our listeners on Twitter and in an email. I think this is an important question that it's easy for me to say and call things burnout, but why should we not call it burnout, and what should we use instead?
So this is an area where I think reasonable people disagree, and a lot of people do great work under the umbrella term of burnout. I specifically have chosen to stay away from it because I think it can be confusing. I want to talk about depression, and I think as physicians, we understand what depression means, and we understand the severity of that and the need to respond and to get treatment, and also to prevent it. My concern about burnout, specifically as a clinician who takes care of other clinicians, is that I sometimes see people who are clearly depressed calling themselves burned out. And I think in those cases, it is a dangerous euphemism. I also think it gives the administration some cover to think about this as a less serious problem than it is, whereas it's very difficult to deny the seriousness of depression and suicidal ideation.
Right.
Another question was, will getting treatment affect your board applications?
Yeah. So as we did mention before, there are states that specifically ask about mental health disorders and mental health treatment. And so I would say first, don't lie, because that puts you in a vulnerable position. But second, disclose only what you have to. So in Massachusetts, for instance, there's a question that says, do you have a condition that would impair your ability to practice medicine? And that was written in a vague enough way that I didn't really know what exactly they were asking or how I needed to answer. And I will say it took a lot of work while I was writing my piece about my own depression and investigative journalism to actually get a straight answer. But the answer to that question is no. So you are being treated appropriately. Having depression doesn't mean you can't safely practice medicine. The second thing I would say is that, even in those states that do ask about this, they very rarely deny your license application for that reason. So, be honest. And then if you are worried, I would consider getting a lawyer to, help you, get through that process.
Okay. Well, I think we've given like a pretty thorough and wide-ranging I guess more wide-ranging than, we've given a pretty wide-ranging discussion here and a lot for people to think about. And certainly all of us are available on social media if there's follow-up questions and if people have suggestions for future episodes or something like that. But we should probably get your main take-home points now, just so we can be respectful of your time and let you go.
Sure. So my main take-home point is that this is a problem that's going to affect most, if not all of us, whether or not directly, it's certainly going to affect our colleagues and our loved ones. So don't feel like you're the only one, and be proactive about taking care of yourselves. That's my first point. And then, my second point would be that, therapy is a really great thing. It is a thing that can, sort of help us, be better physicians, even in times when we may not have a diagnosable mental health disorder. We're certainly experiencing difficult things with our patients, with our family members. So I think that that's an incredibly important resource and tool for us. And it's important to seek it out before you're depressed and you may not have the energy to do that. And then, I think the third thing is to think about, if we're telling our patients that mental health is important for us to take care of, that depression is real, that, whatever psychosocial or psychiatric distress they're experiencing is legitimate and deserves treatment, then we need to start acting that way amongst ourselves. And we need to start, bringing that kind of compassion to our colleagues. Otherwise, it certainly rings hollow for them as well.
I think that's a great way to end. And thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
That was excellent, Elisabeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Curbsiders, bringing you a little knowledge food for your brain hole.
Yummy. Yummy.
I thought Shreya was going to do it.
Oh.
Get show notes at thecurbsiders.com/podcast and sign up for our mailing list at thecurbsiders.com/knowledge food to get our show notes in your inbox.
I was too hungry. We're committed to providing you with high-value practice-changing knowledge, and to do that, we need your feedback. Yes, you, listener. You, the one listening. So please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or contact us at thecurbsiders@gmail.com. A special thanks goes to Shreya Trivedi and Nora Taranto, and to our social media team, Hannah R. Abrams on Twitter, Beth Garbitelli on Instagram, and Chris the Chew Man Chew on Facebook. Until next time, I've been Dr. Stuart Kent Brigham.
The special thanks was because Shreya and Nora wrote this episode and produced the episode.
Oh, yes.
And I've been Dr. Matthew Frank Watto.
And I suck at reading the outro.
Yes. I'm Dr. Shreya Trivedi. Thank you. Good night. Take care.
Good night to Paul out there.
I know.
Night, Paul.
Poor Paul.